we're in an arms race, but it's not an arms race of like who can build better technology. It's an arms race of this technology is happening so quickly and our society absorbs things not at that pace. And so like I'm not by no means am I advocating slowing down, but I think just even awareness that that's the issue, I think is really important because then we can start to address it, whether it be through education or others. We need a better way for people to really truly understand what's happening.
Join me in welcoming Raffi Krikorian. He is the Chief Technology Officer and Managing Director at Emerson Collective. Raffi was before that actually also leading self-driving efforts at Uber. I think you were responsible for the launch of the first ever self-driving Uber fleet. And you've also been leading a 500-person global team at Twitter, where you were in charge of the platform. So I'm very, very interested about this conversation now because you have been exposed at the cutting edge AI, basically. And I see you're also very passionate about educating people about the nuances of technology.
Absolutely.
So let me start with this easy question, very easy question. The
Okay.
easiest question of all. What is our relationship to technology?
I mean, like we have like a symbiotic one, right? Like, I used to say, like at last year, if you asked me, I would mention this word coexist a lot, which people sort of gave me strange eyes when they look at. But like that's really what we've been doing forever at this point, right? Like we coexist with this type of stuff. Like people ask me about how we're going to deal with AI emerging into our society, as one example. And then I remind them we've been living with AI for a while in our society. Like think about your Netflix recommendations or Siri on your phone, all this stuff. Like AI has been around for a while now. But when it comes to technology, especially, it's just like we can't imagine a society that wasn't technologically powered at this point. And that also goes back a long time, like whether it be cars or steam engines or a telegraph, like all these things. So that's sort of like where my mind comes to. It's just like this coexistence sort of like mentality.
And how much influence do we have on it, right? Because I mean, there are three schools, right? One could say it's a autonomous and a determinate force, and we have like zero influence on what's happening, right? Like Eliel or Heidegger and so on. And then we could think the opposite, right? Which the European Union agreed on in their own declaration that technology is a product of human shaped by human values, so we can change basically anything. Or you could have this approach of Van der Poel, for example, who says that it is a co-evolution. So there are points in time where we have a huge influence, but then there are other points where we have almost no influence. Like, where would you put yourself in this spectrum?
I'm a very optimistic person. And so like a lot of the work I've been doing recently, especially when you think about educating public and others, is because I believe that we can actually dictate how we want this coexistence to work. Like I feel that right now, why are we in a place where people feel like they can't control it, or why do people feel like they're in a place where these type of things are inevitable? I fundamentally believe it's because we sort of like both given up our we've given up responsibility to understand how these technologies work, and we found ourselves in a place where we've gotten like blasé and just don't care. I mean, like let me just give you a few examples, right? Like you go to a website every single day, a new app every single day, and those apps put up a privacy policy in front of you. Vast majority of people do not read these things. Or GDPR pop-up shows up to tell you about cookies. Vast majority of people don't read these things. And those points, you're effectively abdicating control. Like you're basically giving away all your responsibility or your ability to have responsibility control about what's going on. You're giving away your ability to send a market signal of like what's actually important to consumers. You've given away all these things. So when people say that like technology is not able to be controlled, I'm going to go back and say we've just given up our chance to control it. We can still get that chance back. Like we can still absolutely get that chance back. Like right now, my mother-in-law, for example, she understands why we don't change speed limits on highways. She understands that because they're there. They're a safety mechanism. If you go too fast around a turn, you might literally fall off the highway. Your reaction time. viscerally gets all. But does she understand what the pros and cons are of having a video doorbell? Does she understand the pros and cons of using, say, an iOS device versus an Android device? Which she doesn't. And in fact, she's abdicated that. She'll just ask me, or she'll be like, "Well, I've bought Apple devices all my life. I'm just going to keep on buying Apple devices." So we've given up our ability to control these things. We've given up our ability to send signals back to the creators of these technologies. So I stay I'm not sure I believe in any one of those 3, except maybe if I had to really choose, it's probably the second one that we can control it, but it requires us to be curious. It requires us to be inquisitive. It requires us not to simply go along with some marketing jargon and decide to go and try and buy and use a piece of technology. It really requires us to be like deeply introspective on what this coexistence relationship should be.
Just to play the devil's advocate there, that you're absolutely right. But then again, evolutionary, it takes us lots of energy to think about these things in a deep way, right? So most of the time, we are actually on autopilot, right? Like 10,000 decisions every day are being done. The vast majority of it, you're not even aware of that you're doing, right? And then you have these companies, these companies are like literally playing on that, right? I mean, they're
Yep,
reverse engineering humans, right? Like
that's
their
right.
feed, their Facebook, and even Twitter, and so on. This is all engineered, right? It's not by chance so addictive. It's like, it is so addictive because they just play into variable reward. They play into all these things
Yep.
purposefully. So they try to hack us, and then when they succeed, of course it's also our fault. But then you can also ask, like,
Yeah, you can't blame the victim. Like that's not an appropriate thing to do. But at the same time, I would say that yes, these are all true statements. Decision fatigue is a real thing. People don't necessarily need to, but like there is a there we have a notion to try to solve this right now. It's called the democratic process as well. And I feel like our government, at least here in the US, has also abdicated a whole bunch of control. Like they've also given up a bunch of things and allowing technology companies. And look, technology companies do a lot of great things for all of us. But you have to remember that, at least here in the United States, they're dictated by financial incentives. Like that's fundamentally how a corporation is set up here in the US. And the role of a government could be to introduce other forms of incentives onto this conversation, societal incentives, privacy incentives, all these things. In fact, some of these incentives might already exist in our US Constitution. They just might not be employed properly. And so, like, the government has also been abdicating a bunch of things. So, if you were to think about a three-legged stool where there's like the developers of these technologies, you have the consumers who use these technologies, and you have the government who potentially could be regulating or adding other incentives. Both consumers and government has sort of like fallen off on our responsibilities. And so, one way to solve this, if we can't push it to the end users, is for government to sort of step up. And at least in the US, they're trying, they're at least making noise about it. We haven't gotten very far, but at least they're starting to make noise about it. So that's kind of step one, at least.
I have read the regulation that the European Union has drafted for artificial intelligence, and I think like many things of those things actually really make sense, right? I not so much agree with GDPR, because not because I think privacy is not important, but I think the way they approached it is a little bit faulty, right? Because at the end of the day, I bring this story, right? It's like if I have a bathroom that has a window to the street, right? And if I take a shower, I'll make sure that nobody can look into it. But with GDPR, they reverse this in such a way that I can leave it open, that nobody in the street is allowed to look. And I think that is it actually leads to what you said, even more so giving up, because then you just feel like, oh, I'm protected anyway and I don't need to do anything. But factuality, they cannot protect you like this, right? You have to take care of it for yourself. But when it comes to AI, I think these things actually really make sense. I think it is important that when you talk to a bot, and I mean, you know that I love this technology, but at the end of the day, when you talk to a bot should tell you that it's a bot and not a human, because they have this very unique ability to build intimacy at a level that was never there before. I
Well,
mean,
I mean, to your point of like they're hacking us. I mean, that's effectively right, right? Like, I mean, they've been, I think there's two things going on right now. Like, one, us as human beings, we have the ability to anthropomorphize rocks, like literally. Like, I don't, when I was a kid, it was not unpopular for people to have literally pet rocks. So like literally people would anthropomorphize rocks. And then all of a sudden, these rocks now have power of language. I mean, like it's clear to see that there's like a mental hack going on that's like touching on some like core evolutionary thing going on in our head. So yeah, I also agree that we need to figure out some ways to have both like both disclosures, but also some form of like content provenance and all these other things to understand, like, properly make sure we attribute and reference and things like that to people because yeah, they are hacking our brains. And like they're hacking our brains because again, there's a financial incentive for them to do so. Like they want to build a product that you go to repeatedly over and over and over again. If anything, this is the lesson we should learn from social media. Like that was designed in such a way to make it so that it's so frictionless for you to hit a button to say like, or it's so frictionless for you to hit a button to give a reaction to it. But no, but it's actually quite hard to give it deep thought. And so they've taken that exact same mentality and brought it over to these AI chatbots. Like they want to make it so frictionless and easy for you to engage and be entranced by it because that again matches their financial incentive. I'm not faulting them. That's just sort of the rules of the game that we've laid out.
At the same time, I think the rules that we've laid out with this, which ultimately is the capitalism. I don't know if you've read Jeremy Rifkin. He argues that the more we go into this near zero marginal cost society, the less capitalism will actually work. And in some things, he seems to have a point because if you look at the centralization that we are seeing, right? Take music industry as an example, right? When like 20 years ago, you would go and you would pay 10 euro or I don't know $10 for a CD, and it had what 12 songs, 13
Yeah.
songs, and you had like 800 selling points where I was living around that, and now we have zero selling points for companies, and it's like basically it's free. I mean, it's $4, I don't know, $8 that you pay for music, and you can hear every music in this world. Which makes it very hard for any other company to ever be able to enter.
Absolutely.
So you're really centralized. And I remember when I was younger and Bill Gates had this, fantastic career, would argue like, is there ever going to be a person who reaches $100 billion wealth? And that question is clearly answered now, right? So I think there is some kind of centralization going on, which of course is a problem. Right?
I agree. I mean, I think that like, I mean, I think in that centralization is also self-reinforcing of just like once you start the centralization, then like there's like a power. I mean, like another way to look through look at all these dynamics is through the lens of what I do a lot on my podcast is a lens of like tech, humanity, and power. And so like in some ways, centralization causes power to shift. It shifts to these central actors and then they're incentivized to maintain that power position. They're incentivized, like you see this again, going back to AI, you see this happening in AI right now, right? Like the big power centers are also places where you're going to have to do all your training work because they're the ones who have now the cash to accumulate the compute necessary, the data necessary. And so it's a self reinforcing model. In a lot of ways, I believe, and I think I'm not the only one, that education is one way to shift power around. And if we can shift power around, maybe we can get out of this like centralization death spiral. There are pros to centralization. Maybe that's too strong, but this like pro centralization theme and sort of like distribute it slightly. I also believe that like diversity of thought is probably a good thing. Like people see things from different angles. We talk about things from with different ideas and different lenses. And this centralization notion, this power centralization notion, has a problem with that.
In that sense, what is your opinion on Mark Zuckerberg's? And I think it's more so he's head of AI that are doing only open source, and I think they have done surely great, fantastic actually models. Llama 2 was, and even in the version 2, it is also commercially usable. I like the stipulation there. It is commercially usable until I think you have a revenue of $1 billion. So basically, you're excluding like 5 companies, but everybody else can use. What do you think about that? Is that do you think that open source is going to catch up with what in OpenAI or Anthropic and others are
Yeah,
doing
I
right
mean there are multiple questions here. Like so like again, so let me one say that I'm actually a member. I'm a proud board member of the Mozilla Foundation. So I fundamentally believe in open source as sort of one pathway to sort of like again shift power around, to do innovation, to do all these things. When it comes to I think there's a few things going on. One, to your question directly, do I think that the open source models will catch up? This is again where I'm super optimistic. Like I fundamentally believe in researchers and computer scientists, and I think that like you give them a hard challenge and they're going to try to figure it out. So like yes, I believe that the open source models, given time, will catch up in a lot of ways. And I think that especially I find it really interesting that like, the French have been doing massive investments in open source, that all these countries around the world are starting to really lean into it. So I think, yes, I think technically they'll catch up. I think, though, one caveat I want to put on this is that we live in this interesting time. So if we had this conversation, say, 2 years ago, then we would have a lot of time for open source, especially in the AI world, to mature, to catch up, to have a real discourse against that and closed source models and what regulation could look like. We live in 2024, though. And in 2024, literally half the world's population is going to have some form of democratic election this year. And so, like, that throws an interesting wrench into this conversation. So, without an election lens on, I would say open source is clearly the answer. We need to have transparency into what's going on. That is going to be the road to both security and to innovation. I think there's a whole set of pros around it. However, in 2024, with the elections going on, like this set of tools can now be used in a rampant way to confuse voters, to spread misinformation, do all these things. I'm not by any means saying we should stop them. I'm not by any means saying that that we should clamp down on open source and leave it only to the closed source companies that control their platforms to regulate themselves, because again, we can't really regulate as a country or a government. We haven't quite figured out how we're going to pull that off yet. However, that is the key wrinkle. So I feel like whenever we have this debate about open source and AI, it really comes to the weaponization of these tools, and through the hyper lens of 2024 elections coming up. I understand that argument. I'm still willing to bet on the long run, which is like this is the path to security, safety, and innovation. But 2024 is going to be a rough wrinkle, whether open source is what's going to cause it, whether it's these tools in general is what's going to cause it. But these elections are going to get a little rough because of the existence of all these tools.
Yeah. Yeah. They already got rough with very, very mundane tools,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that Internet and other things said in terms of what these
And
tools.
we're already seeing these tools being used, right? Like we saw an audio deep fake happen in one of the European elections. We're seeing video deep fakes already starting to show up on TikTok and other places. So like we're seeing these being deployed. Like there in the United States elections, there was even a fake robocall that was done to try to prevent people from doing primary election turnout in New Hampshire. And it was a fake robocall of President Biden's voice. So like we're already seeing these tools. So, but I feel like we need to, this is one of those, again, if you think of that three-legged stool analogy, this is one of those that we need platform companies to step up, which are starting to do, but we need government regulation in place. We need public education in place. Like we can't put all our eggs in one of these baskets. It's too complicated of a problem.
Yeah. I agree with you this education will really help, right? I mean, I bring as an example my daughter, right? I have two daughters, and sometimes I call her on WhatsApp, and I see, that she's on WhatsApp, but she doesn't pick up. And then I go like angry, right? She's like, "Why don't you pick up when I call you?" And she's like, "Why should I pick up? Like I didn't have the urge talking to you at that." I grew up at a time where the telephone, right, was somewhere else in another room. And then somebody called you. That was like an event, right? Now you're going to the movies or something, right? You pick up. Is it my friend? Is it my sister and I would fought who can like actually pick up the phone. They live in that time where like picking up a phone is not a special event. It's usually just a disturbance
Kind of
of what you're
annoying.
doing. Exactly. And annoying. And they got used to this, right? And they have actually a more natural relationship to that thing than I had because
Yeah,
of the experiences that I have done in my life. And I think that will not. The only problem there, the only caveat there is this, right? And while I absolutely think that even a deep fake video, which is, very emotional, right? Then we generally tend to concentrate much more on plastic, visible signs of violence rather than, hidden systematic things. But even that will, over time, people understand, like visually understand that it might not be true, which is very hard for me and you because we grew up in a time where like video wasn't fake, right?
sure.
But for our children, it's maybe not the case. The problem is if that takes 25 years,
Yep.
what happens in these 25 years
That's
actually
exactly right.
matters, right?
That's exactly right, and especially because elections right now, going back to elections for a second, elections are won on the margins, right? Like, there's no clear winner or loser, so any one of these things could tip an entire election because, like, it might not be the youth that gets confused by this, it might be the elderly voter that gets confused by that, and suppressing that might be enough to tip an election.
Generally, I think that democracy, um, probably even rightfully so, is much more about a, a vocal minority than a silent majority, right? So if you can really mobilize even a small portion, it can have a huge effect. Yeah, and you are also very passionate about that because I saw you actually worked for a party, right?
I worked for the
Okay.
Democratic National Committee. I was there from 2017. I was brought in right after effectively the Russian hack that happened in the 2016 elections here in the US to clean up after that, to secure the party, and to also figure out what was the right infrastructure needed to really supercharge the party going into the 2020 elections. So yeah, but like at that point, a lot of my concerns weren't AI, although we used AI a lot in the back end, like voter modeling, voter contact, voter outreach is all AI driven. But it was disinformation, but sort of before this AI supercharged version of this disinformation, like we literally had volunteers that would help us report misinformation, and like we would try to trigger the automatic systems on all the different platforms by everyone hitting the report button, like that kind of stuff.
Let's switch a little bit because you have so much experience also of visual models, right? Because at Uber, I think you're just, I mean, I assume it's just about visual models there. Then, and we can see now with, with these LLMs clearly that they have abilities that we didn't think were possible, at least at scale and at speed and so on. But, in vision is not, we're not quite there yet, right? Actually, I would even argue we're rather far away, right? I mean, if you look at Tesla is trying to do the self-driving car. You have also worked on this. It's still a difficult, very difficult issue. But at the same time, language, like we can say master. So do you think that that is inherited because the problem is more complex or is there any other reason behind it? And do you think we are going to overcome this anytime soon?
Well, one, I don't think we've mastered language by any means, right? Like if you like, can I ask a LLM to write me the next Taylor Swift song? I mean, it'll get close, but it's not going to fool me for being Taylor Swift, right? Like the emotive characteristics are not there. Or can I ask it to write me an article that sounds like it's written by one of the writers at the Atlantic magazine, right? Like, so we're not quite there yet. Maybe we've mastered the ability to digest and to summarize. Maybe that's the thing. But the creation is still a really, really hard one. And but to your point on vision, while Elon is really focused on vision, which I get. I mean, that probably makes sense in the long run. Like, we make so many camera sensors a year, that's financially makes more sense. If you can make it so that you only needed camera sensors on your car, that probably makes your car cheaper in the long run. Um, but again, to your point, like we're not there yet. Like when we built cars at Uber, and if you look at other self-driving cars on the road, like they're doing multimodal things, like they're taking in
Yeah,
lidar and
yeah, yeah.
radar and vision and trying to make sense of all three because there are different failure modes across all of them, and try and get them to all work is probably a path to a more robust system, at least in the short to medium term. Um, but like it's fundamentally just like it's a higher dimensionality problem, right? Like language versus vision is sort of like at least my view on it. And so like we just have a lot more work to do and just a lot more data to process and a lot more understanding in order to get better and better at it. And also like, there's probably still jumps in algorithms and hardware that needs to happen in order to make it happen. Like if you go into a self-driving car today, you'll find a noticeable lag based on what you see on the road and the car's reaction time, right? And that's purely a hardware and software processing pipeline that needs to sort of get more optimized and tuned to be a lot faster and have the right hardware behind it. So I appreciate the difficultness of the problem. And we're tuned to be visual beings. So like our specificity on what we see is obviously also a lot more advanced to than sort of like the one dimensional thing of sort of what we're listening to.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that you say is actually very right. I think that there might be, I'm not 100% sure, but there
Mhm.
might be another effect too. And the other effect is this. And here I'm going to borrow a little bit from Kant. When he said there is at least two things which is a priori knowledge that we need to have to be even able to communicate with each other, which is one is like to make sense of the communication and make sense of the experiences we have. And then one is an understanding of time, and the other is an understanding of space, right? And I think both we can assume to be right, because in 2014 they gave the Nobel Prize to a team that found grid cells, which basically like almost a GPS system. Now with language, we have actually done that to some extent, right? Because with positional encoding, we
Hmm.
can now very well say of a word, where are you in this?
Hmm.
And with vision, we have not achieved it yet, at least not to the degree that we can do it. Why? Because, if you look at a camera, the depth of it, yes, you can trick it with a LiDAR and a radar and
Sure.
combining it. But if you don't, then it's very hard for any vision model to actually understand the contours and understand that this is behind it and this is in front of it. And now, if that part is missing, then of course, building an internal representation of it is going to be faulty, because of what are you building the internal representation, right? So I think if we can better understand how we could encode space into any image, then it would help us, I think, a lot to. And it's still a more complex problem, because it's just just more state that it can be than a language, because after all, the language is following grammar, and images are just following not even, but reality at least is following physical laws.
And look, I'm not a vision researcher by any means, but there's also, going along those lines, like it's hard to separate out vision from meaning, similar to how it's hard to separate out words from meaning. And so like there's also like the encoding of just like what exactly am I seeing? Like the way that our eyes work are very different than the way camera sensors work. And trying to get that gap to close, it seems to be an incredibly challenging problem.
A very important point, right? Because we are actually, I used this in a talk once. I said, we are actually constantly hallucinating. We just
Yep.
don't, we just don't realize it. It's not the way we think it is that we are experiencing the world and then trying to make sense of it. We are trying to make sense of a world that fits then some kind of, prediction. And we make it fit even if it doesn't fit, right? Even it's close by, we still go,
Yeah,
this
and
is what I saw.
there are all these like child illusions you can play to like demonstrate that your brain is
Exactly. They
like trying to
demonstrate.
fill in all these gaps. Like,
Exactly, right? So it is the other way around, which makes it an extra hard problem. Yes, yeah. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of research going on, and then one solution might also be combining these two, right? Like
yeah.
using the encoder, a separation encoder, but a decoder from an LLM, basically, because it already has an inherently understanding of the world somehow. So we could use that, and
I
then
mean,
the
like hilariously, I was reading a paper on the archive the other day, which was effectively trying to use GPT-4 to build a self-driving car. So like basically like smashing it all together of just like we upload the video, we upload a picture, an image to the LLM, we tell it a prompt and basically say like, what degree should I turn the car next? And like it like drives very badly, but better than random. So like there is definitely something there, sort of like along this hybrid on these hybrid lines.
yes. Yeah, I mean that is, by the way, one of the things that I also core believe, that not only hybrid in the sense of language and vision, but hybrid in the sense of human and AI
Yeah.
is also very important, and not. And I think it's important for a couple of things, and I want to get your thoughts on this. So first of all, I think it is important because in most of what we make a decision of is a value in it hidden somewhere, right? Like take ESG as an example, because it's the easiest example, right? Like the social part of it is interpreted very differently in some countries compared to other countries, right? So there is value instilled into this exercise of understanding ESG. And now, if I train an AI, what does it actually learn? Like, does it learn these parts of it? So I think that in any case, we will not only need, but we should design a future where we have this human in this hybrid thing, because after all, we can suffer. The machine cannot suffer. And this suffering gives us the right to make decisions in comparison to a machine.
I'm of a similar mind. I mean, this goes along with my optimistic frame. Like I'm very optimistic with sort of like this 1 + 1 = 3 scenario, just like human coexisting with AI actually might give us better outcomes. And there's a lot of data and papers to sort of justify that sort of like thinking, especially with really complex scenarios, all the way down to, I was talking to a Stanford economist the other day of like he runs trials inside call centers. And so they did an A/B test to like they remove call center operators and remove it with and replace it with basically speech to text and some LLM behind it and have customers interact with that. Or on the B side of the test, we provide tools powered by these same LLMs to the call center workers that make them more effective and more efficient. And it's obvious which one in the long run seems to work out. It's like not replacing people, but instead giving them tools to become more effective, also gets to better customer outcomes and all these things. I'm a huge fan of sort of like going down that train of thought of just like, how do we build systems that sort of work along each other? And especially in the short run, where we have these tendencies to build systems that are optimizing for single metrics. To your point that like humans feel harm, if you're optimizing on single metric, who is it? Stuart Russell who has that like, I want to build a robot that gets me a coffee and it kills people and destroys my house on the way to getting me the coffee because it's the shortest path to getting me a coffee. But like that single metric optimization is something that humans are good at spotting and good at not doing, like, because like we realize like we live in a social world, we're social beings, all these things. So like as especially as these systems are developing, this symbiotic notion is really important. But I'm also willing to place the bet that in the long run, this 1 + 1 = 3 is a situation of like building tools will actually benefit us all in the long run.
Yeah, I can see it in medicine. It's very visible already, right? So you have this image scans, and then you have just AI is better than just a human, but human and AI is by far like it's AI only because now new things come into this. Yes, I also think that, and I think that that's going to be even with these huge advances that we have. You were saying you were reading something on archive. I just found out that there are 4,000 new articles about AI every month on archive, and the
Oh, is
average
that
was
true?
somewhere about 2,000 the whole year, right?
That's
2 years
amazing.
back. And then 2 years back, we said it's so much already, but now it's like 4,000 every month.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
without AI, it's almost unreadable. You need now AI to actually summarize it for you so that you know which
I
one.
mean, my wife was the one of the chairs of ICML, the International Conference for Machine Learning, last year, and I remember them having this whole argument of LLM would they allow papers that were written by an LLM to be submitted into ICML? And I think last year, I could be wrong, but I think last year the answer was no. I'm
Correct.
really curious what to say this year. But to your explosion point, like if like these these papers using tools to write themselves is just going to cause even more of an explosion of all these papers that we're going to need to sort through and try to figure out what's really knowledge and what's not, what's just being rehashed and things like that.
The answer was no. I don't know what it is right now, but the most famous like FT45 and others just said like you're not going to post.
You're still not allowed. Yeah.
This is very interesting. What do you think about what do you think when you I don't you probably I mean I'm sure you know of, but maybe I've also read Harari and his view on, because he seems to be a little bit diametrically because he's very pessimistic right now. He's like saying basically what he's saying is that hacks the hacks the fabric of our society because it is so good at language. And I think the examples that you brought are all right. I agree with you. But the thing is this, there is only all your examples that you bring are very special people, right? People who already is very good at it. But if you take an average person, right, then I think we are already definitely there. And I made this experience. I made this experiment, and my experience was this. I went to ChatGPT, asked a couple of questions where I know the answer, and I was just trying to, get an answer. One of my questions was, "What is the color of the uniform of the Napoleonic guards at the Napoleonic Wars?" And you know what? I knew the answer, and I don't know it anymore. The reason why I don't know it anymore is because it was so convincing that then I had to go back and read and verify that I was right. And I was right. But along the way, I forgot the truth anymore. And right now, I can't tell you anymore. I could tell you, but I can't tell you right now anymore.
Sure, sure.
So, and I think that's the point of Harari, because he says, I mean, look, his view is very aggressive in the sense of, he says that everything is basically just a story. And because
Yeah,
everything is just a story,
yeah.
language is the most important part. So what do you think about his
No, I mean,
well?
I mean, I'm not gonna disagree with him. He is brilliant. But what I will say is like this. I think it requires a finer point. I think that right now, um, we're in an arms race, but it's not an arms race of like who can build better technology. It's an arms race of this technology is happening so quickly, and our society absorbs things not at that pace. And so, like, I'm not by no means am I advocating slowing down, but I think just even awareness that that's the issue, I think is really important because then we can start to address it, whether it be through education or others. We need a better way for people to really truly understand what's happening. Otherwise, we go into this runaway scenario. Otherwise, we go to your previous points. We go into what is a scenario one where we can't control this technology because we've just allowed it to run away. And so, like, I like to bring up, Finland did this experiment in 2018. So before this generative AI wave, they fundamentally believed, or there was a professor in the University of Helsinki who fundamentally believed that the entire Finnish population needed to better understand AI in order to become better citizens. And so he launched this campaign to effectively try to get 1% of Finnish citizens to take an online course that educates them about the basics of AI, the pros, the cons, the usages, etc. 10% of the Finnish population ended up going through this course, which was obviously 10x what they wanted. But it also means that now Finland, on some metrics, has the highest per capita AI startup culture, uses AI in every single part of their society, from city planning to the government to the military. People would write into this course, plumbers would write into this course, talking about how that course fundamentally changed the way they think about their business. So, like, I think there is a chance to not allow the world that Harari is pointing out to occur, but the window is closing. Like, we need to figure this out now. Going back to my three-legged stool, we need to either figure out how to bolster the end users or we need to figure out how to bolster government. But like, we need to figure that out now. The only other option is to hit the brakes. I don't think we should do that. I think I'd much rather figure out how to bolster those two parts of the stool so we can keep moving forward quickly.
2 points I want to make. So the one is, I agree. Actually, in this podcast series, I had a interview with a very esteemed um, um, doctor, a physician who is in charge of AI, and he, I think, did the first FDA approved pathology with AI. And he was saying something very interesting. And the point that he was making is this: how ethical is it even that you don't use a technology that can help people, right? Because, like, I mean, at the end, if you follow Childress' 4 principles of benevolence and non-maleficence and so on, that you almost have this inequity and autonomy. You always have this, it's always mandatory to actually do it, use it, right?
And also, like, medical trials have this notion built into them, right? Like, if you're like, when you do an A/B trial or whatever the right terminology is, not a doctor, but like if it's going so well, they just suspend the trial. They basically say like everyone should get it because there's an ethical problem of leaving some people out of it. So like, yes, that there is this tension here that we need to manage.
Yes, yes. And to the other part, I think like I also probably not probably I am much more on the optimistic side, and that is very much driven also by the order of what you read. I often say this because when I studied economics, I first read Karl Marx, and I was a total Marxist, socialist, whatever. And then I read Adam Smith, and I was a hardcore neo-libertarian. And then I read Keynes, right? So the order is actually important. Luckily, I started with Heidegger, and so now I'm also on the positive side. But I think that you are actually in your argument very close to Harari, because we need to figure it now, because in the past, the way we figured it out is through wars, essentially, right? Because essentially, we couldn't, settle the distribution of wealth the best way. So we did the First World War, right? And then we had even a bigger problem. So we did the Second World War, right? And then luckily the forces understood that to stop this, we maybe need to distribute better, and didn't, post these things on the Germans. The problem is, though, we can't repeat this process because the
Yeah,
weapons and technologies we have right now would like
are
literally destroy
exponential.
the world
Yeah,
if
yeah.
we just go.
Well, I mean, like, I also spoke with on my podcast. We're just going back and forth the podcast.
Yes, please.
The Ian Bremmer, and he's a political scientist, and one of the questions I asked him was just like, there doesn't is there can we as a society figure out these things before a disaster occurs? And there isn't, to your point, there isn't a lot of evidence we can, right? The financial crisis in the US is what caused financial regulation to occur. World War One and Two caused a bunch of changes to the world social order to occur. And so, like, jokingly, I'm almost half jokingly saying this, like, is a Taylor Swift deepfake enough for the US Congress to sort of like get its act together? Like, is that enough of a crisis to occur? But like, I don't think we're really bad. We're like human
There's
beings are
one.
really bad at a few things. Like one, we're really bad at exponential growth. Like
Oh yeah.
we don't process things that way. And two, we're just really bad at fighting inertia. And so like we need like a big disruption in order for us to get out of our inertial states in order to go do
True.
something.
True. But there's one example, right? I think there's one example, and I think that and this is as you know, somebody who grew up in Europe, Europeans don't always have a good opinion about the U.S. Diplomacy, but I have to say what the U.S. has done after World War II with nuclear energy
Sure.
and nuclear
Sure.
regulation, actually, we have to admit that it worked.
Yes,
I
but
mean,
like there was a clear example for us to go and viscerally see the power that we're unleashing, right? Like
sure,
two huge bombs were dropped, whole series of tests, public tests happening in like Pacific atolls. So like, I mean, are those disasters? Now we can have a semantic argument of those disasters or not, but like there was a visceral thing for
oh
us
yeah,
to
the
like wrap
visual
our hands
thing
around.
needs to happen. I agree with you. I mean, there Zizek makes this point. I think it comes actually from Hegel that we generally need this, almost need these visual, these like plastic, very big things happening, right? I mean, look, think about this way. Germany changes its whole energy policy based on something happening in Japan, which is basically driven by a very sad pictures, right? But just it's like a very plastic kind of violence, and that makes you change things. Like even the policy on immigration in Germany changed because one, I'm very like, deeply sorry, but one died child, changes a whole country's immigration
Yep.
policy because
Yep.
I mean this is just one picture, right? At the end of the day. And there's so
Yep.
many other people that
I mean, but
and
this gets to Harari's point. It's all stories, right? Like, it's all stories.
right. And you can tell them much better with this plastic thing. So yes. Yeah, I mean, I think we have, but I think it is the Obama doctrine, which is like, okay, if you have this kind of thing, which can be very bad, but it can also be good. If all the good people don't do it and only bad people do it because they
Yeah.
will continue to do it, then what
Yeah.
happens, right? It will definitely, per definition, go into this bad direction, right? So I think, I think it is, a little bit, with all the respect, I mean, he's a great man, but it's a little bit shallow to think of it this way. But ultimately, he's right, right? I mean, ultimately, we can't just ignore it, right? There needs to be something done with this
Or we
behavior.
can ignore it, but then there's a whole set of consequences to us ignoring it.
Exactly. You're right. Which you pointed out at the beginning, right? We give up our own autonomy at the end of the
Yeah.
day, and that's a big problem. So, what do you think about the next couple of years? I mean, it's very hard to predict. I
Yeah.
understand, and you're not gonna even go there.
I don't even know. Like in the grand scheme of things. Like I mean, to my point earlier, like we're so bad at exponentials and we're clearly on some form of exponential curve right now. So like I have no good way of predict like, could cancer be cured in the next 2 or 3 years? Maybe. I mean, like, maybe. Like all these things that we deem to be fundamentally impossible, could they just really turn around? Like, there's a whole bunch of organizations, nonprofit and otherwise, supporting all these big AI efforts. Like the Bezos is like putting all these efforts into AI and climate. There's all this work happening up in the Pacific Northwest around building better designer drugs using, I mean, like all these things that we claimed were impossible, people are now trying to tackle in new and different ways. So like, I don't know. I mean, the only thing we can predict for sure, it's going to be a wild ride. But besides that, like, I just don't know.
Yeah, you bring up a very interesting point, right? We not even probably, like definitely need already AI to actually make sense of all the data that we have.
Yeah,
Because you can think of AI
that's a good
really
point.
just be a different representation of the data, right? And we already need it because we can't make
We can't make
meaningful
sense of the
decision
world
about the
anymore.
climate without
Yeah.
these tools. But at the same time, if you follow Suleiman, then he says, okay, great, but all these things have some kind of revenge effect, right? And you actually touched upon this, because when you say like the financial crisis of 2009 basically was created by the same people who
Yeah.
solved it
Fair.
30 years back when they said tap into your home equity,
Fair.
right? Nobody knew back then that, wait a second, like 30 years down the road, it can lead to these things. And if we ever make it complex, at some point, we are going to be so reliant, probably past that point, to be honest with you. But even if you haven't passed it, we'll very soon pass this point where it's so complex that we don't even have a chance to understand it.
We need better structures on how to understand complexity as a society. I mean, look, I'm, you know, there was a whole bunch of work being done by the World Health Organization years ago to to detect blindness or predict blindness in children, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And there was a whole bunch of different statistical models being used at the time, and they literally had to go with one that was a worse predictor because it could be better explained to policymakers. And so, is that really the world that we're going to go on? That we need to go with potentially worse solutions in order for us to be able to explain it to people better? I mean, maybe. I mean, maybe that's not a horrible world to live in. Like a solution is better than no solution, even if it's not the most efficacious one. But I think, like, just generally, we need to figure out ways to understand complexity and manage complexity as a society better, whether it be like empowering academics, empowering storytellers, empowering, figuring out better ways to like better educate our leaders. But like, this is going to be a recurring theme. Like, if anything that we can predict over the next few years, this explosion in complexity, this explosion in our inability to understand. So we're going to need to be making investments into explainability, into transparency, into education, because we're like this. This is going to be the thing that really bites our society. Is this like complexity explosion that's about to show up?
Yes, I agree. I want to ask you one more last question, if you allow, because
Oh, go for it.
I think it's an older statement that you made once, but I found it so interesting. You made it says like, I mean, I pick it out of a whole video, but you said like every problem is ultimately a scaling problem,
Yeah.
right? At some point. So, what's your take on it? Because um, um, I think it's actually very hard. Scaling is actually hard, much
Yeah.
harder than you think about it. So, what's your learning? What tips can you give to our listeners?
Well, I mean, like, I think a lot of it is to sort of make sure we don't forget the lessons of the past. So, like, when I made that presentation, every problem's a scaling problem. It was both a tongue in cheek. Like, I helped to build a lot of the original infrastructure that powered Twitter back in the day. So, A, we need to scale Twitter to match worldwide demand. But B, to scale Twitter technologically, you also need to scale the organization that managed it. So, like, these scaling problems are deeply interlinked. So like you scale technology, which requires more people, etc. And so the biggest takeaway for me is just like a lot of these lessons, not all of them, a lot of these lessons have been learned already. And we just need to be better scholars of what's happened in the past for us to take those lessons moving forward and really focus on like, well, what's actually new here? Like we don't need to reinvent the wheel 12 billion times. What's actually new? And let's focus our energies on understand that. So I think when I reflect on like every problem is a scaling problem, I'm like, yeah, every problem is a scaling problem. We've learned to scale lots of things as a society. Now, what are really the variables at play when it comes to AI? Speed. Speed is one of them. That's new. And then the level that we deployed it, like the raw numbers has gotten to. So first derivative and zero derivative are what's sort of like new on the AI front. Let's focus our efforts there. There's a whole bunch of lessons that we can learn from scaling other technologies, whether it be social media, we can see all the bad things that occur from that. Whether it be atomic energy, we can learn all the ways we did there. We don't need to go to base principles when we think about AI. We've already encoded a whole bunch of our societal learning and values in the ways that we've approached other problems. So let's not just dismiss scholars who've worked on other issues. Let's not dismiss regulation that's already occurred in the past. Let's figure out what's new and like make sure we stand on the shoulders of giants and get this one right.
Love that last quote. Uh, and I find it so interesting because ultimately, Einstein obviously proved Newton wrong, but I think that Newton really had to start from zero, where Einstein didn't. But Newton had this notion. He said that too. He says like, I actually stand on the shoulder of giants, but there was no giant before you, man. You did everything yourself. Yes, you're very right. Raffi, thank you so much. Very, very, very insightful, very interesting. Thank you for
Vahe, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to this edition of Hybrid Minds. This podcast is brought to you by Coegnize, the first of its kind intelligent document processing company, which automates unstructured data with hybrid intelligence and a data-centric AI platform. To learn more, visit Coegnize.com. And be sure to catch the next episode of Hybrid Minds wherever you get your podcasts.